Hello, hello, it's Mr. Grow, and today we're talking about modern women's rights. So we've already talked briefly about like the middle part of this story. I think we picked up at about the progressive era and worked our way from there. But here's a little bit of review of stuff we have and have not talked about. There was the Republican motherhood in the 1780s. So it was like an early take on women's rights and women's agency. You know, there was this message that women had this power in that they were raising the men that would then go and do the things, if you will. And then by the 1800s, the early 1800s, the script flipped a little bit, and it was the cult of domesticity. And that's sort of like your classic wife stays at home, does the family things, and just kind of does mom stuff, if you will. And the wife's role, the woman's role, was sort of confined to the house, maybe to the community, but not much else. And then we had the antebellum reformers, and for my Latin aficionados out there, you'll know that means before war. This referring to the Civil War. So before the Civil War, we had the antebellum reformers, and they were big advocates of the temperance movement, and which actually went on to become the Prohibition group. But yeah, they were advocating for morality and obviously temperance, nonviolence to an extent, and pretty much adherence to religious standards. And then we had our progressive era reformers. This should sound familiar to you. Not only were they advocating for women's rights, but a lot of progressive era reformers were women, and they were just advocating for change for the better in general. Things like workers' rights, child safety laws, things like that. And then, of course, we have the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, but we'll talk more about that later and some of its weaknesses, some of the things that it didn't cover. And then, of course, World War I and World War II, women stepped up big time and kept the country running during those wars. They entered the workforce, trained other military personnel, things like that. And then by the time the 50s rolled around, we talked about this in one of our videos, the cult of domesticity returned, and the woman typically was then confined to the household again, doing mom stuff, doing, you know, community type things. Very gendered in the roles that they were assigned. And before we move on, let's take a Breaking Barriers break. Some of you might remember Victoria Woodhull. We talked about her briefly. She's the first woman to ever run for president for the U.S. in 1872, 48 years before women even gained the right to vote in presidential elections. And who could forget Frances Perkins, who was the first woman to serve in the cabinet position within the U.S. government. FDR appointed her to be the Secretary of Labor, and she served from 1933 all the way to 1945. Back to our regularly scheduled programming, let's talk about feminism, and when you boil it down to its very simplest definition, it is the advocacy for women's rights based on the equality of the sexes. Now, like all of the other groups that we have talked about and that we're going to talk about in this unit, it is not a monolith, right? There is diversity within the group, and different people have different takes on what feminism is. On one end of the spectrum, you have sort of the, I guess, quote-unquote moderate feminists who just want nothing more than equal rights, equal pay, and to just be looked at as another person, not as a woman, right? And then you have, on the other end of the spectrum, the, I suppose the more radical, I don't want to use radical as like a term against them, but like the more radical feminists. And those are the person that you'll see like burning bras in the 60s and 70s and doing things like that. And again, like we've talked about, each of those different approaches to activism is effective in their own ways, right? They're reaching a different audience, and they're coming from a different perspective, a different background, and they have their own unique reasons for why they're approaching it in that way. So when you think of feminism, don't just think of one picture of what a feminist is or one singular message aside from this, simple definition. It is a very diverse group full of people from diverse backgrounds, and all working towards the same general goal, but in sometimes different ways. And with that out of the way, now I'd like to talk about Betty Friedan and her book, The Feminine Mystique. And here's a quote from it. Each suburban wife struggles with it alone. As she had made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night, she was afraid to even ask of herself the silent question, is this all? So this book is notable in that it captured the frustrations and sense of isolation that many women felt in the 1950s. And if you remember that video that we made, it was our post-war culture video, a lot of you commented on that about how these women who were confined to the role of housewife or mom and really stuck inside the house must have felt isolated, and especially if they had been working for the war effort only a handful of years prior, this shift must have been very jarring to them. This book also captured the challenges, it challenged the role of women in the house and the cult of domesticity, which we mentioned before, and it encouraged women to seek fulfillment in professional careers rather than confining themselves to just the role of wife, mother, or homemaker. What about some legislation? Surely there was something that was trying to fix these issues. Well, yes and no. We had the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and that made it illegal to pay women and men working the same place and same position different salaries. The problem here is that it wasn't enforced, and it's sort of hard to enforce that. You'd have to have a massive governing body dedicated to monitoring something like that, and unfortunately, it just didn't happen. I mean, it's there, but it just didn't make much of a difference. A similar thing can be said about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we've talked about several times, and part of that act was that there would be no job discrimination on the basis of sex. This was a little bit easier to enforce, but there were still instances, and there still are instances, where there is job discrimination. I mean, think of all the industries today that are still largely dominated by men for really no good reason, right? So, again, even though this is on the books as official legislation, more needs to be done. And now let's take another Breaking Barriers break. Margaret Chase Smith was the first woman to run for president for a major party. Some of you may remember her because I think, we mentioned her back in our special Election Day coverage back in November. Anyways, her name was placed into the nomination at the Republican National Convention in 1964. She was also the first woman elected to serve both the House and the Senate. And of course, this person should also sound familiar to you, Shirley Chisholm. She became the first black woman in Congress and the first black person to run for president in 1972 on a major party ticket. It was the Democratic Party ticket, if you were curious. Now let's take a look at a little bit of a timeline. So, in 1966, the National Organization for Women, NOW, was founded, and it focused on pro-equality laws and workplace discrimination. In 1970, the EEOC filed a complaint against Newsweek. Now, this is something that requires a little bit of background information. So you remember how I said it was really hard to enforce the aforementioned legislation? Well, this is a great example of that. Newsweek was guilty of some pretty blatant discrimination in their hiring practices. Journalists with the same talent and the same qualifications were being separated on the basis of sex. Men would typically get the good, actual hard-hitting journalist jobs, whereas women would be hired as mail girls, secretaries, and researchers. So they're in a very big way being left out of the spotlight and being left out of being able to pursue their career. So, like I said, in response to this, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, filed a complaint on March 16th of 1970. Then finally, in 1972, Newsweek promised that by the end of 1974, one-third of the magazine's writers would be women, and by the end of 1975, one-third of those hired or transferred into foreign correspondent positions would also be women. And on top of that achievement, this complaint against Newsweek filed by the EEOC sent a message to other groups of women being discriminated against that it's not okay, that you should not have to settle for a worse job because you are a woman. Moving on, on our timeline at least, in 1971, Gloria Steinem publishes Ms. magazine, and it was, of course, like a feminist-oriented magazine, but the title is notable in that it uses Ms. instead of Miss or Mrs., and this is reflective of a movement going on at the time where women would choose to be addressed as Ms. because it is ambiguous whether or not they are married or single, and they would do that because, well, it should be none of anyone's business if you're married or single. It should have no bearing on how you're seen, the job that you hold, or anything like that. And finally, in 1972, we have the Equal Rights Amendment, which was passed in Congress, and Title IX. What are those, you might ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. The Equal Rights Amendment says that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of sex. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Pretty simple, right? Well, as we all know, simply having an amendment passed in Congress is only about half of the journey. You then have to have 3/4 of the states ratify that amendment, and therein lies the key battle here. So on the pro side of the ERA, we have the folks like, by the way, in this picture, that is Representative Bella Abzug from New York. But anyways, these folks are the ones saying that the legislation that we have right now simply isn't enough to guarantee equal rights between the sexes. They're saying that, like we just discussed, what we have right now is simply not enforceable, and the Equal Rights Amendment gives Congress a pathway to make legislation that actually is enforceable. Not only that, but it would give the Supreme Court a more solid legal standing to argue for or against, certain discrimination cases that come across their desk if there is an actual amendment for that. On the other side of the argument, you have women like Phyllis Schlafly, and she argued against the ERA for several reasons. Reason one is that she thought that the Equal Pay Act of '63 and the Civil Rights Act of '64 were good enough, that the genders were already equal enough, as she said. But as we talked about before, that's not really the case. Neither of those pieces of legislation are very easy to enforce. She also argued that the ERA would disproportionately give young women an advantage over middle-aged women who don't have very much skills to enter the job market if they would need to. And while that is a good point to make, I don't know, one has to consider that why would you not pass this and help nobody instead of passing this, helping the young women of the world, and maybe create some extra legislation to help middle-aged women get the skills and education that they need to enter the workforce. I don't know. Food for thought. And finally, she argued against the ERA because she thought that it would open up the draft to women. And, I want to remain as objective and neutral as possible here, but I feel like this argument is pretty easily refuted, depending on how you look at it. But that's a discussion for another time. Anyways, going back to our handy-dandy timeline, we'll see that in 1923, the ERA was first proposed in Congress, and it was proposed in every Congress, meaning every year, since then, until 1972, when it was finally passed in Congress on March 22nd, and then sent to the states. In 1978, Congress votes to extend the deadline for ratification to June 30th of 1982. In 1982, the deadline passes with 15 states still not ratifying, and the ERA falls 3 states short. So fast forwarding to 2020, Virginia became the 38th state to ratify the ERA. And in 2021, the House of Representatives voted to eliminate that aforementioned deadline. Also, Nebraska, Tennessee, Idaho, Kentucky, and South Dakota have voted to rescind or withdraw their ratification of the ERA, but Congress has determined that those have no legal validity. So, as of right now, deadline is gone. 38 states, which is the minimum threshold for actual ratification, has been met. So, in theory, it should be good to go. But we're going to have to wait and see what actually happens. So here's a map of all the states that have ratified the ERA, and the little pin icon things are the states that have ratified after that deadline of June 30th, 1982. And you can see a pretty clear pattern coming up here. Pretty much the only states that have not ratified it are the southern states. And that really shouldn't come as a surprise, since the southern states have historically been the ones to oppose civil rights and activism, things like that. Also, for some reason, Utah and Arizona have not ratified it. That could be for a number of reasons that I don't really want to get into here. But yeah, it's interesting to see these patterns sort of pop up. So next up, I want to talk about Roe v. Wade, and that was the Supreme Court case in 1973 that legalized abortion. Now, because we're already at about 16 minutes here, I'll spare you the legal nitty-gritty stuff of that case, but essentially this is what you need to know. It legalized abortion. This was and still is a very controversial case, and it's a very big platform of the Republican Party today, and has been since 1973. And really, it's boiled down into two main kind of camps here. We have the pro-choice and the pro-life folks. So without arguing for one side or the other, I'll just talk about what each side is about. So the pro-choice crowd is not for abortion. Notice how it's pro-choice, not pro-abortion. To be in the pro-choice camp, you don't have to like the idea of abortion. You're just leaving that choice up to the person. You're saying, look, it's not up to the government to decide. It's up to the women and their bodies, and it's their right to choose. Hence the name pro-choice. And then on the pro-life camp, it's more or less anti-abortion. And they support their cause for a number of reasons. Religion being a large component of that. Oh, and one more thing I want to mention before we move on is that the pro-choice crowd argues that abortions are going to happen regardless of what legislation is out there preventing it. What that means is that you're going to get these really unsafe, sort of like, under the table abortions going on, and that poses a real danger to everyone involved in that procedure. So they're arguing that just give people a safe way to do it if that's what they choose. But again, they are not necessarily for abortions. They're for, well, the right to choose. And that's all I'll say. We can move on now. Okay, so next up, let's talk briefly about Title IX. Remember way back in the middle of this video when I mentioned it? Well, we're coming back to it. So Title IX protects people from discrimination based on sex in education programs and activities that receive financial assistance. What does that mean? Well, it means lots of things, but its biggest impact has been on athletics at the high school and college level. Put simply, if a school has a sport, they have to have a team that both women and men can participate in, right? So if a school has a basketball team, there has to be a basketball team that women can be on. And those two teams need to receive equal funding and equal support from the school. And, pretty simple, right? There have been more than a few schools that have just eliminated sports altogether because they didn't want to have a women's team for that sport. And there's also been some violations, especially recently. I think it was the, I can't remember which school off the top of my head. I want to say it was in San Antonio, in Texas. It was probably a number of schools. But anyways, they were not providing the same workout equipment to the women's team as they were providing to the men's team. And that's a blatant Title IX violation. They're not receiving the same support. Okay, but we'll move on. I see I'm edging close to 20 minutes here, but there's a lot to talk about, and it's all really important stuff. Anyways, timeline. Back to our handy-dandy timeline. 1978, there was the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which meant that you couldn't discriminate against somebody who was pregnant. So, you can't, fire somebody for being pregnant. And actually, no, it goes further than just protection against being fired. This applies to pay, hiring, promotions, assignments, anything like that. You cannot get discriminated against for being pregnant. On a similar note, in 1993, we have the Family Medical Leave Act, and that allowed women to take 12 weeks of leave to care for their families, or as like maternal leave, something like that. And I misspoke there. This doesn't just apply to women, it applies to all workers. Any worker that needs to take this leave can do that. Then in 1994, we have the Violence Against Women Act, and that introduces more accountability for people who commit acts of domestic violence. In 1996, we have U.S. versus Virginia, and that strikes down the Virginia Military Institute's male-only policy. Fast forwarding to 2009, we have Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which extends the time for women to file for complaints. So before this, there was like a statute of limitations on how long you could wait until you filed a complaint, and this got rid of that. And then in 2013, women officially were allowed to serve in combat for the first time, and in 2016, the first woman major party nominee for president, that was Hillary Clinton. And in 2021, of course, we have our first woman vice president of the United States, Kamala Harris. Okay, and then finally, what's going on in the 21st century? And we're going to talk about this stuff in greater detail in the first week of May. First week of May. But we have the Me Too movement, which is doing some really important stuff in terms of like sexual harassment and things like that. We have women's marches, breaking barriers and things like NBA coaching, Super Bowl referees, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies like, off the top of my head, the president of General Motors, which is a gigantic car corporation, is a woman. I think she has been in that position since like 2013. Anyways, there's also a ton of women in Congress right now, especially in this most recent election. A lot of conservative women have been in Congress too. So yeah, let's keep up the good work. It's really great to see all of this representation in Congress. But there's still work to be done. I feel like, again, a broken record saying that there's still work to be done, but that's the reality of the situation. We are making some great steps, but it's not over. It might never be over. We're all, humans are imperfect, so there's always going to be things that we need to work on. Okay, so there you have it. Sorry this video went a little bit long, but this is really important stuff, and I hope you guys learned a lot from it. And I look forward to our sort of end of the unit discussion on the 21st century stuff in early May, because that is, is very interesting and very applicable to all of you. With that, that's the end of the video. Have a good rest of your day, guys. Bye.